Hello and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Wyenberg. This time we will continue our reading of Village Affairs by Miss Reed. Miss Reed has just received a letter from the school board saying they are indeed considering closing Fairacre School. Now what should I choose for our morning hymn? Oft in danger, oft in woe might fit the case, or fight the good fight perhaps? No, let's have something bold and brave that we could roar out together. I opened the book at Ye holy angels bright who wait at God's right hand, and looked with approval at the lines. Take what he gives and praise him still through good or ill whoever lives. That was the spirit, I told myself, as the children burst in, breathless and vociferous, to start another day beneath the ancient roof which had looked down upon their parents and their grandparents at their schooling years before. I guessed that the vicar would pay me a visit, and before playtime he entered, holding his letter and looking forlorn. The children clattered to their feet, glad as always of a diversion. "Sit down, dear children," said the vicar. "I mustn't disturb your work." That, I thought, is just what they want disturbed, and watched them settle down again reluctantly to their ploys. "I take it you have had this letter too?" "Yes, indeed." "It really is most upsetting. I know it stresses the point of there being no hurry in any of these decisions. Nevertheless, I feel we must call an extraordinary meeting of the managers, to which you naturally are invited, and that after that, I suppose we may need to have a public meeting in the village. What do you think?" "See what the managers decide. But I'm sure that's what they will think the right and proper thing to do. After all, it's not only the parents, though they are the most acutely involved, but everyone in Fairacre." "My feelings exactly." He sighed heavily, and the letter which he had put on my desk sailed to the floor. 6 children fell upon it like starving dogs upon a crust, and it was a wonder it was not torn to shreds before the vicar regained his property. After this invigorating skirmish, they returned to their desks much refreshed. The clock said almost 11:15, and I decided that early playtime was permissible under the circumstances. They clattered into the lobby, and the clanging of milk bottles taken from the metal crate there made a background to our conversation. "You see, there was some foundation for those rumors," commented Mr. Partridge. "No smoke without fire, as they say." "It began to look ominous when the measuring started at Beech Green," I responded, "and Mr. Salisbury was decidedly cagey, I thought. Oh dear, I hope to goodness nothing happens. In a way, the very fact that it's going to be a long, drawn-out affair makes it worse. I keep wondering if I should apply for a post elsewhere before I'm too old to be considered." The vicar looked shocked. "My dear girl, you mustn't think of it. The very idea! Of course you must stay here. And we shall all see that you do. That's why I propose to go back to the vicarage and fix a date for the managers' meeting as soon as possible." "I do appreciate your support," I said sincerely. "It's just this ghastly hanging about. You know, the mills of God grind slowly, but they grind exceeding small." The vicar's kind old face took on a look of reproof. "It isn't God's mill that's doing the grinding," he pointed out. "It's the education office's machinery. And that," he added vigorously, "we must put a spoke in." If he had been a Luddite, he could not have sounded more militant. I watched him cross the playground with affection and hope renewed. They say that troubles never come singly, and while I was still reeling under the blow of that confounded letter, I had an unnerving encounter with Minnie Pringle. Usually she had departed when I returned to my home after school on Fridays. I then removed the wet dusters from whatever crack-brained place Minnie had left them in, put any broken shards in the dustbin, and set about brewing a much-needed cup of tea, thanking my stars that my so-called help had gone home. But on this particular Friday, she was still there when I entered the house. A high-pitched wailing greeted me, and going to investigate, I found Minnie sitting at the bottom stair with a broken disinfectant bottle at her feet. She was rocking herself back and forth, occasionally throwing her skirt over her mop head of red hair and displaying deplorable underwear, including a pair of tights more ladders than fabric. I was reminded suddenly of those Irish plays where the stage is almost too murky to see what is happening, the only light being focused dimly on a coffin with 4 candles, one at each corner, and a gaggle of keening women, while a harp is being plucked in a lugubrious harmony by some unseen hand. What on earth's the matter, Minnie? Don't cry about a broken bottle. We can clear that up. It ain't the bottle, wailed Minnie, pitching herself forward with renewed energy. What is it, then? She flung herself backward, hitting her head on the 4th stair up. I hoped it might knock some sense into her. Ah! Yelled Minnie, and flung her skirt over her head once more. I took hold of her skinny shoulders and shook her. The screaming stopped abruptly, and the skirt was thrown back over the dreadful tights. Now stop all this hanky-panky, I said severely, and tell me what's wrong. Sniveling, Minnie took up the hem of her skirt once more, but this time applied it to her weeping eyes and wet nose. I averted my gaze hastily. Come on, Minnie, I said more gently. Come and have a cup of tea with me. You'll feel better. She sniffed and shook her head. Gotta clear this bottle is broke, she said dimly. Well, let's find a dustpan, and you do that while I make the tea. She accompanied me to the kitchen, still weeping, but in a less hysterical fashion. I found the dustpan, for some reason best known to Minnie, among the saucepans, and handed it over with a generous length of paper towel to mop up her streaming face. I then propelled her into the hall, and returned to prepare the tea tray. At this rate, I muttered to myself, I shall need brandy rather than tea. 5 minutes later, sitting at the kitchen table, the tale unfolded in spasmodic fashion. It's Ern, said Minnie. He's coming back. Ern, I knew, was the husband who had so recently deserted her. And you don't want him? Would you? No, I said without hesitation. But can't you tell him so? What, Ern? He'll hit me if I says that. We'll get the police. He'll hit me worse if I tells them. I changed my tactics. Are you sure he's going to come back? He wrote to Auntie, she can read, you see, and said his place was at my side. What a nerve, I exclaimed. It hasn't been for the last few months, has it? Well, it's different now. That Mrs. Fowler don't want him. She's turned him out. So Amy was right after all, I thought. And when's he supposed to be coming? Minnie yet let out another ear-splitting yell, and I feared that we were in for another period of hysteria. Tonight, he says, and I'm too afeard to go home, and what'll Bert say? Bert? I echoed in perplexity. My boyfriend, what works up Springborn Manor, Minnie said, looking coy. I remembered the rumor about the undergardener who had been consoling Minnie in her loneliness. What about Bert? He'll hit him, too, said Minnie. Your husband will? Yes, bound to. And Bert'll hit him back, and there'll be a proper set to. Minnie's fears seemed to be mingled with a certain pleasurable anticipation at the prospect, it seemed to me. Well, you'd better let Bert know what's happening, I said, and he can keep away. That is, if Ern comes at all. Perhaps he's only making threats. Minnie's eyes began to fill again. He'll come all right. He ain't got nowhere to sleep, see? And I dursn't face him. He'll knock me about terrible, and the kids. What am I to do? You say Mrs. Pringle has the letter? Yes, she read it out to me. She'll be over at the school now, I said, putting down my cup. I'll go and see her while you have some more tea. I left her still sniffing and sought out her aunt, who was balanced on a desktop, dusting the partition between the 2 classrooms. My, what a start you gave me, she gasped, one hand on her heart. Can you come down for a minute, I said, holding out my hand for support. It's about Minnie. Mrs. Pringle, twisting my hand painfully, descended in a crabwise fashion and sat herself on the front desk. I faced her, propped on my table. She's in tears about that husband of hers and seems afraid to go home. I knows that. She's been no better than she should be while he's been away. He'd promised her a thunder and good hidin'. But he's threatening her just because he wants somewhere to sleep. It all seems most unfair to me. After all, he left her. Maybe, but his place is in his own home with Minnie. But he's intimidating her. Well, natural, ain't it? How else she get that last baby? I felt unequal to explaining the intricacies of the English language to Mrs. Pringle and let it pass. The point is, Mrs. Pringle, that it really wouldn't be safe to let her go home if he intends to come and knock her about. Should we tell the police? Mrs. Pringle bridled. What, and let the neighbors have a free show? Not likely. But the children, Mrs. Pringle's face became crimson with wrath. She thrust her head forward until our noses were almost touching. Are you trying to tell me what to do with Minnie's children? I'll tell you straight, I'm not having that tribe settling on me with all I've got to do. I'm sick and tired of Minnie and her lot, and the sooner she pushes off and faces up to the trouble she's made, the better. So you won't help? I've done nothing but help that silly girl, and I'm wore out with it. I can understand that, and I think you've been remarkably patient. But now what's to be done? I really think the police should be warned that there might be trouble. Mrs. Pringle's breathing became heavy and menacing. Just you try it. You dare. I've been thinking about the best way to tackle this ever since I got that Ern's letter. He can talk, going off with that old trollop that's old enough to be his mother. I began to feel dizzy. Whose side was Mrs. Pringle on? What I'm going to do, said my cleaner, is to go back with Minnie and the kids tonight and to sleep the night at her place with the rolling pin on one side of me and the poker on the other. I'll soon settle that Ernst hash if he dares put a foot inside the place. We don't need no police, Miss Reed, I can tell you. Splendid, I cried. Can I go and tell Minnie? Yes, and I'll be ready to set off in half an hour sharp. Tell her, just as soon as I've got the cobwebs off this partition. She heaved herself up onto the desk again, duster in hand, and I returned home thinking what a wonderfully militant band we were in Fairacre, from the vicar to Mrs. Pringle. Chapter 12. Militant Managers. The extraordinary managers' meeting was called during the last week of term, and great difficulty the vicar had encountered before gathering them all together. The long hot spell had advanced the harvest, and Mr. Roberts was already in that annual fever which afflicts farmers at this time of year, when the vicar rang. However, he nobly put aside his panic and agreed to spend an hour away from his combine harvester, as the matter seemed urgent. Mrs. Lamb was supposed to be at a flower arranging meeting at Caxley, where someone of whom Mrs. Lamb spoke with awe in her voice was going to show her respectful audience how to make large displays for public places from no more than 5 bought flowers and the bounty culled from the hedgerows. Mrs. Lamb, whose purse was limited but who enjoyed constructing enormous decorations of bulrushes, reeds, branches, honesty, and even beetroot and rhubarb leaves, was looking forward to learning more, but gave up the pleasure to do her duty. Mrs. Maughan had a bridge party arranged at her house, but was obliged to do a great deal of telephoning to get it transferred to another player's. As all the ladies vied with each other in preparing exotic snippets of food to have with their tea, this meant even further domestic complications. However, it was done. Mrs. Moffat was busy putting the final touches to a magnificent ball dress which was destined to go to a Masonic ladies' night, but set aside her needle to be present while Peter Hale, recently retired from the local grammar, now comprehensive, school, cursed roundly at ever being fool enough to agree to be a manager when the grass wanted cutting so urgently. Resigned to their lot, therefore, they assembled in the vicar's dining room one blazing afternoon and accepted a cup of tea from Mrs. Partridge before she departed to her deck chair under the cedar tree, there to read, or rather to skip through, the final chapters of a very nasty book, strongly recommended by the book critics of the Sunday papers, and dealing with the incestuous relations of a sadistic father and his equally repulsive teenage daughter. The fact, much advertised by the publishers, that it had already sold 30,000 copies and was now reprinting, gave Mrs. Partridge more cause for regret than rejoicing, but she was determined to turn over the pages until the end so that she could give her trenchant comments on the work and truthfully say she had been through it in more ways than one. No one appeared from the office on this occasion, but I was invited and enjoyed my cup of tea and the comments of the managers. "We've got to be firm about this," said Mr. Roberts. "Say no from the outset. I mean, what's village life coming to?" "How do you mean?" asked Mrs. Moffat. "Well, we used to have a village bobby. Remember Trumper, Padre?" The vicar said he did, and what a splendid fellow he was. "Exactly. Used to hear old Trumper puffing round the village every night about 2 o'clock, making sure everything was in order." "Sounds sensible," agreed Mrs. Maughan. "We need more police. That's half the trouble these days." "And what's more," went on Mr. Roberts, "he gave any young scalawag a good clip round the ear hole on the spot and stopped a peck of wrongdoing. What happens now? Some ruddy juvenile court 6 months later when the kid's forgotten all about it." The vicar coughed politely. "Quite. We take your point, but it is the school closure we are considering." "It's the same principle," said Peter Hale, coming to Mr. Roberts' support. "You need direct contact. That's the unique quality of village life. If we lose the village bobby, it's a link broken. Far worse to lose our village school." "Too little spread too thin," said Mrs. Lamb. "Same as having to share you, Mr. Partridge, with Beech Green and Springborn. Why, I remember the time before your day, of course, when the vicar was just for Fairacre, and you could reckon to see him any time you wanted if you were in trouble. He'd be in his study or the garden or in the church or visiting in the parish. Now he can be anywhere." The vicar nodded and looked unhappy. "Not that it can be altered," added Mrs. Lamb hastily, "and a marvelous job you do, but nevertheless it's not the same." "I suppose there's no hope of this school staying open for infants only?" asked Mrs. Maughan. "The biggest objection is hauling the babies to Beech Green, I think." "It's too small as it is," I said. "Even if the Beech Green infants were brought here, both schools would still be too small according to the authority." The arguments went on. I was touched to see how concerned they all were, not only for the children's sake and mine, but for the destruction of a tradition which went back for over 100 years. "If we give in," said Mr. Roberts, "we're betraying the village as I see it. Our Fairacre children get a jolly sound grounding. You've only got to look at the percentage we used to get through the 11+ exam to go on to the grammar school before it turned into this blighted whatever it's called. I propose we send a reply to the office saying we're firmly against the idea of closure." This proposal was carried unanimously, and the vicar promised to write the letter that evening. The clock stood at 4:30. Mr. Roberts rushed back to his combine, Mrs. Moffat to her ball gown, Mrs. Lamb to the telephone to hear all about flower arranging from a friend, Mrs. Maughan to study the bridge column in last Sunday's paper in lieu of her game, and Peter Hale to his lawnmower. I stood in the vicarage garden and looked across at our modest, weather-beaten school across the way. "Never fear," said the vicar, clapping me on the shoulder. "It will be there for another 100 years, believe me." "I hope so," I said soberly. Amy called unexpectedly that evening while my head was still humming with the memory of the managers' meeting. I told her a little about it. To my surprise, she seemed to think that Fairacre School was doomed to close and that it would be a good thing. "Well, I'm blowed," I exclaimed. "A fine friend you are. I suppose you want to see me queuing up for my dole before long." "Well, no," replied Amy with what I thought quite unnecessary hesitation. "Not exactly, but I do think this place is an anachronism." "How can it be if it serves a useful purpose in the village?" "I sometimes wonder if it does. Oh, I know all about fathers and grandfathers doing their pothooks and hangers under these very windows, but it's time things changed." "My children don't do pothooks and hangers." Don't snap, dear. What I'm trying to point out is that things have altered considerably. For one thing, those grandfathers came to Fairacre School when it boasted 100 children or more, as the logbook shows. It was a real school-sized school then, and enough boys present to play a decent game of football or cricket among themselves if they wanted to. Team games aren't everything. And then this building, continued Amy, waving a hand. It's really had its time, you know. The very fabric is crumbling, as Mrs. Pringle points out daily. And those antiquated stoves, and that ghastly skylight forever letting in rain and a wicked draught. It's really not good enough. I wonder what the parents haven't complained before now. I was speechless before this onslaught. Perhaps Amy was right. She often was, I knew to my cost. I changed the subject. You were right about Mrs. Fowler, by the way. She's pushed out Minnie's husband, and Minnie's afraid he'll come back to her. With that row of children to look after, I should think she might welcome him. I told her about Minnie's fears of aggression and how Mrs. Pringle had gone into attack. Amy listened avidly. And did he come? No, thank heaven, but they expect him daily and barricade the door over the kitchen table whenever they go out. The children think it is terrific fun. Children are odd, agreed Amy. I remember how Kenneth used to insist on having the more lugubrious parts of Black Beauty read to him while the tears rolled down his cheeks. He was about 6 then. Kenneth was a brother of Amy's who was killed in the last war. I met him occasionally and could never take to him, finding him boastful, selfish, and frequently untruthful. He was a confounded nuisance to his parents in his teens, as so many boys are, and they were wonderfully realistic and cheerful about it. However, no sooner had he died than their attitude to the young man was completely transformed. To hear them talk of Kenneth after his death, one would have imagined him to be a paragon of all the virtues, kind, noble, a loving son, and a devoted friend to many. So does death transfigure us. Perhaps it is as well, but personally I think one should cling to the truth, in charitable silence, of course, and not try to deceive oneself or others about the rights of the matter. Even now, so long after, Amy's voice took on a reverent note when Kenneth's name was mentioned. I was glad that she remembered him with love, but wondered if such an outstandingly honest and downright person as dear Amy really conned herself into believing Kenneth the complete hero. He was the handsomest of us all, went on Amy, gazing across the field outside the window. Our Aunt Rose always gave him a better birthday present than the rest of us. We used to resent it dreadfully. Quite natural, I should think. And it's about Aunt Rose I've come tonight, said Amy, becoming her usual brisk self. She died a fortnight ago, and I'm cleaning out the house for her. When you break up, could you spare a couple of afternoons to help? I said I would be glad to. It's no joke, I can tell you, warned Amy. She seems to have kept every letter and photograph and Christmas card since about 1910. They'd probably make a fortune at Southby's, I said. Make a hefty bonfire, commented Amy, picking up her handbag. Anyway, many thanks for offering. I'll pick you up one afternoon next week and we'll get down to it. I should bring a large overall and tie up your hair. How's Vanessa? I said as Amy slammed the car door. Besotted with motherhood, said Amy. I think she's going to be one of those mamas who keeps a diary of daily progress. You know, Thursday, baby dribbled. Friday, baby squinted. Saturday, baby burped. It's because it's the first, I said indulgently. Well, her only hope is to have about a dozen. Surely she would be more reasonable then. She drove off, and I returned to prepare a snack for the ever-voracious Tibby. And we will continue with the village affairs, including Minnie's affair and the affair of the schoolhouse, next time.